Narcan is one of them. We hear a lot about, pro Narcan, anti Narcan. Where do you fall on Narcan? Do you think Narcan vending machines should be out there, or do you think it's more presentable in the hands of a professional?
I I like the idea of handing it out. I don't know that you have to be a high level professional. I don't think you have to be a medical provider. Putting that out on the street is a lifesaver.
I live inside my own world of make-believe.
Dan Wise back here, Wise Media Group, with our new program that we're running here, The Streets of Yakima, Homeless and Addicted. And today we have Dave Hanson, the Executive Director of Sunrise Outreach here in Yakima. Dave, welcome.
Glad to be here. So just look forward to working into this and helping our community understand what is going on around them.
The whole point of what we're trying to do here is we spoke a little bit. You and I never met. We've had a couple brief text messages. Our whole goal is to kind of shine a light on, obviously, there's a homeless and an addiction problem here in Yakima, here in the United States. There's a lot of people that will say people are homeless because they don't take any accountability. There's people that will say people are homeless and addicted because there's not enough programming. I think it's clear, it's easy to try to pinpoint something when people don't really understand what the cause is. So I think with the work that you're doing and people like over at Camp Hope and people that are over at the Union Gospel Mission, I think people that are in the trenches realize that it's much deeper than that. And there's a balance that needs to be taken. Obviously, we want people to be accountable, but when you got somebody that's dealing with severe mental health issues, traumatic issues from a young childhood, then getting addicted on drugs, trying to just tell them, hey, stop doing drugs, that's easier said than done. So people like you and other groups in the area, I think you guys offer invaluable services to create a bridge and a gap with an understanding. So tell us a little bit about what you guys do. And you and your wife have a pretty cool story about how this kind of started, 15, 17 years ago, something like that?
It was actually about 19 years ago. We actually formally started Sunrise Outreach as a nonprofit 501c3 17 years ago.
Okay.
And so basically our story was just coming into the community, becoming aware of the struggles here. I was doing a successful business career back then. Definitely had a calling to be a pastor. I think God routed me in a little different direction than the one I thought I was preparing myself for. So as we evolved into a solution mindset, the idea of creating Sunrise Outreach was an outreach ministry of the Vineyard Church. Back then, I had just become an associate pastor, leaving a 30-year career. The idea of feeding families was our initial effort. We had a small little church food pantry that just helped people from our church. But increasingly, we had people coming from the neighborhood. And as we structured a little food pantry operation, the saddest thing was not helping the people, but turning all the people we couldn't help away. So we decided we needed to answer a question. Do we want to stay at the constraint of the church and staying within its means? Or do we want to create a separate organization and build a solution that is relevant to the size of the problem? So we created a separate 501c3 under the umbrella of the Vineyard Church. So we have kind of a commingled board of directors for both organizations. Vineyard stays at some level on the board in order to maintain the original vision and hope of feeding families and housing our homeless. The things that kind of emerged as the Sunrise Outreach 501c3 emerged was that we really had great opportunity with the community. We found that as we looked for volunteers in the community, Once we gave them an understanding of what was happening around them, increasingly people were really willing to give their time. And so shortly after we had really structured a food pantry operation that was really feeding everyone that came for help, we had a question from an individual who only occasionally had come to our church, but who had formerly been homeless. And he had been at a homeless network of Yakima County meeting. Now, that organization had only been in operation for a little less than a year at that point. So back in 2005, it was just getting started. And so I had never even heard of it. This individual asked what I thought about using churches for shelters. And I could immediately think of every reason why that wasn't a good idea. In fact, I could think of a lot of reasons why that was a terrible idea. But the more I thought about it, the more kind of burdened I was about just feeling like I needed to have a second conversation. So we had a much more in-depth conversation. He invited me to the network meeting the folks there, seeing the heart that they had for the homeless neighbors of our community, was really impactful to me. So we made a commitment, a decision, if you will, at that point, that we wanted to start up the first extreme winter weather shelter project for Yakima County. So about 6 weeks later, as we were meeting about 3 hours a day, 3 days a week to put this thing together, we started our first extreme weather shelter in Yakima on Christmas Day in 2006. And so we had two churches, one for men, one for women. And by the next year, we had 3 shelters going. After we had kind of done that first year, we realized we weren't able to figure out how to feed all of these folks that were coming. And, you know, a doctorate theologian once told me, when I asked him about the way he was learning and what was his best experience in the education process, he says it was the realization that the more I know, the more I realize how little I know about anything. And I've kind of held that truth. When we had done that first year, I realized I didn't know anything about either feeding families, food pantries, or shelters, or.
What were the challenges in this?
There were so many challenges. Literally one challenge right after the other. In food pantries, we had grown very quickly to feeding about 120 families every week. And, our church is only so big, and having all these folks coming around our building and having this hope, and we could immediately see that the need was growing. Where do we put all this food? I mean, we didn't have a warehouse. We were using the upstairs and downstairs of the building.
So you're basically just using like spare rooms in the church type of deal. Like in the office, you're going to go put everything in the closet.
And to make things a little more challenging, when we started the extreme weather shelter, we were using the same space as we were using for the food pantry. So we had to move everything, do the food pantry, set up the shelter again and let it run for the week, and then do it again, setting up for the pantry the very next week, and so on. So we really were challenged with, okay, if we make decisions to do this, are we really willing to do what it takes? I've often taught my kids that, love and sacrifice are not separable. It's not an authentic love if there isn't a willingness to sacrifice for it.
When you say sacrifice, is it kind of like what you need to do for the greater good?
What you need to give of yourself to be able to really love that person or that thing.
Right.
And so when we were, as a church, really wanting to feed families and house our homeless, were we really willing to give up a big part of our building to create a food warehouse? Were we really willing to give up the whole auditorium and commercial kitchen and everything else that we were using for our own purpose?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, those things were required, and so as we were growing with the need, the 120 a week for the food pantry quickly grow to a couple hundred a week, and then we started to realize, mostly because the county was involved with kind of telling us what the needs were.
When you say the county was involved telling you what the needs were, was the county involved with what you could and couldn't do, or were they where you're kind of getting your stats from?
Mostly where we were getting our information from. They were very integral in their participation with the Homeless Network of Yakima County.
Any idea where they were getting their information from?
It's easy to come by information at a government level from the state.
Okay.
So all the information that was filtering through for grants and those kind of things, start at the federal level and come through the state commerce.
Kind of like a census was able to pull up a spreadsheet and you can kind of pull up your numbers.
Yeah, county kind of becomes the fiduciary for all the grants that are coming through the state and so forth. So it's all connected. And so the more we learned, the more we realized that we had to be willing to grow. The next question came up, were we going to be limited to being a city of Yakima solution, or were we going to pay attention to the fact that there is a much bigger problem from a county perspective? So if you can imagine the number of communities that are in Yakima. So like the state of Washington has like 39 counties.
Right.
Yakima is one of the larger counties. It has like 4,300 square miles.
Do you kind of know where it starts and stops?
Yeah.
Because I'm new here.
Yeah. So think of about a third of it being Yakima Nation. Think of, I like to refer to it as 13 larger communities or recognizable communities. There's actually many more than that, 23, I think, altogether. But there's 13 that have school systems and those kind of things connected with them. And the poverty level in some of those communities is really, really high. The resources that go into some of these communities was creating communities where there were large underserved populations that weren't getting any help. Just in the education field, for example, back 15 years ago, there were 3 communities where the average adult 25 years of age and older that didn't have a 9th grade education exceeded 40%.
Mm.
So doesn't have a high school diploma. That's never got into high school at all.
Right.
And so when you think in terms of the poverty connected in those communities, you then become really curious about, is this still going on? Is our school system in those locations still producing those results? And we found some pretty surprising things. So we really started delving into community interests. And so feeding families, housing our homeless, community action, and organizational networking became the 4 things that we wanted to be really involved with.
Okay.
So that brings us to where we are now. So we have 6 food pantries across the county that are serving roughly 4,000 weekly food allotments every month.
Now, you referenced the word families a lot. Is this only available for families?
Think of families as households. So it could be a single person.
Okay.
It could be a family of 8. It's a mix.
What about living on the street?
So people that are living on the street can come to the food pantry too.
Okay.
But you have to imagine if they're going to carry a box away, they're probably not going to walk more than a block away from the church with a whole big, heavy 60-pound box.
Right.
So they're either going to bring something like a shopping cart or a backpack or a suitcase or something that they can carry what they need to carry with them. So we have to be really super careful of kind of policing up the area to make sure we take all of the boxes and all of that stuff and don't leave
Garbage and trash
garbage and
around.
stuff throughout the communities.
Do you guys provide like daily meals? Can people go there to get a hot meal type of a situation?
So here in Yakima, we're averaging 40 people per day that come to the church just for food. So yes, we have a whole community around us, businesses and church small groups typify the people that are involved. But for the 40 people that we see on a daily basis, we're giving out about 100 sandwiches a day.
Okay.
Bottled water. If we get lots of pizza donated, we get lots of pastries donated.
Any regular donating organizations, companies, pizza places you want to recommend on or speak of on here to give them a pat?
I don't know that I want to give a plug without their permission.
Okay. Understandable.
So just suffice to say that literally all of the food that goes out to the food pantries, which is millions of pounds of food annually, is donated to us. All of the sandwiches and pastries and water and everything else that we distribute is donated to us. So, we have an organization. If we look at the in-kind value of the food at the state value and the volunteer hours, just on the food pantries alone, we're pushing roughly $4 to $6 million of value out into the community annually. But we have 2 full-time employees and 2 part-time employees
In the entire
organization.
Everybody else is volunteer.
Everybody else is volunteers.
Wow,
So we have about
impressive.
250 regular volunteers.
The funding that you guys require to keep your organization up and running, is it private funding? Do you get funding from like grants, government funding? So I know some organizations are different the way they operate.
So the simple answer is yes. we get funding from all of those places. We operate entirely in the public sector. So we are faith-based, but we have this idea that there are people in need and others who want to help. God's doing as much with those who come to help as those they've come to serve. So we want to give the opportunity for the community to be community.
Right.
And so operating in schools, operating with government offices, all of that makes perfect sense for us.
So the individuals that you guys are helping and assisting, they don't necessarily need to have a faith-based. You'll help anybody and everybody regardless.
That's correct.
Okay, that's cool.
That also includes the people that work with us.
Okay, so the people that work with you don't necessarily have to share your religious beliefs.
No.
What about people that are employed?
Same.
Okay.
So we are very much an equal opportunity.
Awesome. So no matter gender, religious purposes, anybody, if they've got the right mindset, they can get involved.
You don't have to be something to become something. The idea of us meeting people right where they're at is the greatest opportunity to meet God right where he's at.
Right.
And, the idea that they have to be something before they can become something doesn't make any sense to us. So
wish more people shared that type of a view, right? It'd be a much better place where we live. With the individuals that you're helping, feeding, now, do you guys also provide housing, shelters? I think you were saying, how many churches now, is it still all through churches, or do you have something that's over the decades that is transpired into it?
So we have done a lot of building and moving. So we've been involved in a lot of the nonprofits in town in developing them. So helping them get started, setting up organizations, participating on their boards. places like Love Inc., like Rod's House, like Camp Hope, um, and there's a number of others that just don't pop into my mind. Safe Yakima Valley.
I'm making notes right now. These are all people we're going to want to talk to at some point, probably.
Are all organizations that we participated with and help build. And so these are great organizations, and they're moving mountains in this community. We don't feel like we have to do all of the things that we're involved with. We just want to fill gaps, fill the voids, so that life can happen the way it needs to.
So if somebody walks in to get a meal or a box and there's something that you guys don't do, you have no problem pointing them in the direction of another organization that can provide that help.
Do it every day of the week.
You know, we've spoken to a few people, when we won't say names or anything, but there's not everybody shares that value. There are individuals where if they can't help them, there's a cutoff there. They're not gonna put them in a direction of where they can get help because it doesn't necessarily benefit their bottom line, which is kind of a distraction to the whole cause, right? Because you've got people out there that you take a homeless person or an addicted person or a mentally ill individual that's going through life struggles as it is, and you tell them, all right, go here to get this, go here to get this. Now you're talking about transportation and getting your mind right, and you got snow out there. So being able to, do you guys offer, somebody comes to you guys and you can't facilitate what they think they might need, will you give them like a ride to where they need to go, or outreach type programs?
Let's think of everyone who is chronically homeless. Now, there's various definitions for chronically homeless without going through all of those.
Right.
Just embracing the idea that somebody's been homeless for a long time simplifies that a little bit. Enough for this conversation. So the best thing that can happen to somebody that's chronically homeless is they have a home, right? They have a place that they can call home.
Right.
Now, there's lots of shapes and sizes of how a home is defined, but think of it as a prescription for somebody that's experiencing an illness, right? When they have medicine, they have a tendency to thrive. They have a ability to think better. They're feeling better. They're stronger, right? Housing for someone who's chronically homeless is like medicine, right? When we try to give people direction, referrals to go see somebody else, without getting them into housing, it's helpful, but it's not what's really needed. For somebody to be stable in housing, services take on a whole new life. Things like treatment, alcohol, narcotics, whatever. People that are struggling with the variety of spheres under neurodivergence, all the kind of trauma type related things, or all of the DNA related things that can happen with people that are struggling with that. People that are struggling with kind of a co-occurring both and kind of reality in their life, which typifies quite a few of the chronically homeless, right? Having a place that they can call home, creating the stability, then makes service a whole different thing. And it really makes it meaningful. Sadly, we have a very low housing inventory for this subset of population. Frankly, we have a real significant problem with housing inventory in all categories. But for the affordable housing, and specifically for housing available to chronically homeless, we are very, very low inventory, which means that people that are in shelters will stay for a while until they need their independence, and then they go to their independence because it's taking too long to get them into housing. It's not the fault of the shelter. It's
Right.
the fact that there's no inventory. There's no place to have them go.
So that's an interesting topic because this is not knowing much about it myself. Other than I've never been unfortunate enough to be living on the actual streets, but I did go through a pretty severe like cocaine addiction, where in the midst of my addiction, the last place I wanted to be was at home because I was ashamed, embarrassed. I didn't want people to see me like that, so I would disappear for 2 or 3 days at a time. Um, Talking to a lot of individuals on the street here in Yakima, asking them, if there was a home provided to you tomorrow with some basic requirements, meaning, well, and what I mean by that is, let's say Dave is going through something and he's in a house where clean and sober is a requirement, not to, or else you create a potential triggering effect with other individuals if they see you sitting there shooting up in the house. Where is the balance on, obviously somebody's going to go through a period of where they're trying to detox to get to the point where they can maintain a sobriety. Are there houses that offer an entry level, like, hey, look, people here are going through detox, to come into this housing you have to be clean and sober? Where does that fit into the whole problematic solution versus what's the problem?
So don't think of housing as a graduation. Think of housing as housing type. So in congregant living, clean and sober housing is essential, because no one who is in a program can survive in a program if the influence of drugs and alcohol is right there.
Right, if it's present, yeah.
It's unfair to them to not let them have an escape from that, right? So in any kind of congregant living, there has to be some understanding that there needs to be a clean and sober environment. But the best possibility is to have an individual home, and then harm reduction becomes the starting point.
Like a safe place.
Right. Meet them where they're at, not where you want them to be.
Okay.
Right. So if they're struggling with an addiction, let's create the stability with with housing, right? Once they're in the housing, then the hope is they will want to have treatment. Now, in order for it to be successful, permanent supportive housing by HUD's definition, right? A guiding principle would never be to make services a condition of having the house, right? That's the last thing you want to do. Meet them where they're at, give them a safe place, and then work with them, encourage them, help them believe that they matter and that they can get services and deserve those services. And hopefully, treatment becomes a real possibility. But it will take a very loving and caring approach for that to happen.
Is that happening at all in Yakima? Are there any housing opportunities where, because I just want to make sure I'm understanding. So let's say we're take somebody that's chronically homeless in the midst of severe addiction. And fentanyl seems to be the drug of choice amongst a lot of individuals that I've at least gone out and interviewed lately. If you have somebody in severe addiction right now, you're saying provide them with a possibility of a home for themselves, not a group home, like a private home or apartment of sorts.
It's a tricky answer to a tricky question.
It is. It's very, very complicated problems.
So I want to say yes, it does exist. I want to say permanent supportive housing is a context that we should be gravitating to, right? When we fully understand what it is, it's actually the best thing there is out there, right? There are organizations that are doing mostly this context, best practice um, uh, operation, but they're using their own system to feed it. So I love the idea of having a community-wide um, coordinated entry context where all of the people that need housing, regardless of which agency they go to be initially assessed, will put their name with their information in a by name list, and they are going through a vulnerability assessment to determine who has the highest need and who's in the most trouble out on the street. Those are the people that we want to prioritize and put at the highest end of the list. So we've
There,
come up with a demonstration project. When I say we, I don't mean Sunrise Outreach. I mean, this is a community
right.
effort, although we've been very involved with setting it up. We had this new assessment program that we started a demonstration project this past July with. It was approved by the providers to do the statistical analysis on. We did it for 3 months and it was very successful. So now it has been embraced by the whole community. This wasn't the first time we had something like this, but it is a program that has overcome a lot of what didn't work in the past. So we now are able to take a look at 600 people experiencing homelessness in Yakima that come for assessments, right? And we can put them in an assigned numeric category defining how badly they need that housing, right? And so they reside in a database so that whenever a provider has housing available, they can call the county and say, I have 3 beds, or I have 3 apartments, or I have 3 houses, right? And so currently what's being done is they give them a group, maybe 10 of the highest ranked, and then they can do an interview process to see who will fit.
Mhm.
But now we're developing a new idea that we're just getting ready to test, that it's called Papa, mostly because 3/4 of the people in my world call me Papa. um, but the idea is it's a program alignment prioritization assessment.
Okay.
So it takes that vulnerability score and puts multipliers on it, mostly just binary multipliers, zeros and ones. But then for a couple of things that they actually grade a little bit higher, like 1.3, 1.5, and 2.0 is the highest multiplier. And so it's respecting and appreciating the vulnerability score, but each provider has a different program. Some are clean and sober. Some are, you can have pets. Some are, we can take a sex offender in this application, and the ones that can take that person with the high score says, you know, we have filled out a template, given that template with our PAPA score multipliers to the county. The county has this by name list with the vulnerability matrix. It does the math automatically and tells you now who has the highest vulnerability and program prioritization. And so it makes the whole thing much more fair and much more streamlined, and gets people housing very, very quickly.
Regardless of their current mental health or addictive state,
Everything factors into it.
depending on who the
Yeah.
facilitator is.
Right. Everything factors.
So, like, are there? So, who's a group or an association or housing group? I'm not even sure the correct word for it right now. That somebody that knows they're not in a state of mind to get clean yet. They want to be clean, but they don't even know what that road of recovery looks like. Where, I don't know if there's any houses available, but who would they go reach out to? Because the people that I'm running into, these aren't people that are just down and out on their luck, that are just struggling. These are people that are in severe addiction, that the minute they get the next $5 bill, they're going to go buy drugs with it and use those drugs, yet they're living on the street, which doesn't really add any value to the ability to get sober. Where can they go to find or get on a list to where they could get a house knowing that they're using and not even trying to get clean yet or ready to get clean yet? Does that exist?
That is exactly the right question to ask. Okay, so there are three places in particular that currently exist, and that number of access points is about to grow. But for right now, if you go to Yakima Neighborhood Health as a chronically homeless adult, um, uh, they have a super well trained outreach group that will work with the individual, will do an assessment, gather sufficient information, and be able to get them on a by name list. That's a very simplified explanation because they may need services in the interim,
Right.
which they are also capable of helping them with. So, Yakima Neighborhood Health for adults in Yakima, Rod's House.
Is Rod's House just for youth?
So think in terms of youth being teens through young adults up to say 25, but in terms of shelters, at least in the current state, think of youth in terms of 18 to 24.
Okay.
Under that, there needs to be a licensed format
For
children.
For children.
Right.
Now, so it does exist. Any idea of how many active houses, apartments, any idea of what that looks like compared to what the need is? Because it seems like to me what I'm seeing is you've got an epidemic growing faster than a supply can be met for that demand.
So
the bottleneck effect.
Think in terms of the vulnerability score. Let's call that a HENA score. HENA. It's homeless exposure and needs assessment.
Okay.
That's that vulnerability piece I was talking about. So the average chronically homeless individual is scoring somewhere around, say, 5 to 7 in that range.
Is that low?
That's nominal.
Okay.
That's where most of them are landing. Right?
So 5, just so the audience, whoever's watching this, 5 to 7. What type of average mind capacity, thought process, like what is that? If you were to kind of outline an individual, what does that look like?
It's mostly outlining their circumstances, not so much their mental bandwidth. It's not it's not a complex test.
Okay.
Right? Where have you slept in the last 24 hours? How many children do you have into your immediate care? Those kind of questions.
Right.
And so with that score, let's call the average score, say 5 or 6, right? There's so many that fall under that category. It's like a flood of people that all have the same vulnerability,
Mhm.
right? So when we take the PAPA score and add that multiplier onto that vulnerability score, then we start to see a fairly good spread. We think this is what we're going to test here very shortly. But we'll start to see from an individual standpoint who are the highest need people in the best circumstances with programs in Yakima. There's a direct correlation with what the provider provides and what the person who is available actually needs.
Right.
And so marrying those things will be an automatic process in doing
So
this.
I imagine somebody as there's a more of a need, they take a priority. Like you've got somebody homeless on the street with a child is going to be more of a priority than a homeless person living by themselves, obviously. Right. But is there housing right now for?
No. So there's still not enough housing. So think in terms of you have a score between like Henna and Papa if Papa emerges. And we don't know that it's going to look like that. We haven't really even started the trial for that yet. But say it does exist months from now, and we have a range of numbers from say 13 to 5, right? We're going to have a cutoff point based on current housing inventory, where we will communicate to the people on the street. that we can't put you on that housing list right now because there's not going to be housing inventory in the foreseeable future. But if we're going to put somebody on a by name list, we want it to be with the hope that that can actually occur, right? Because every 60 days, they're going to have to come back to that same provider to stay on that by name list, right? So whether
What do
they're,
you mean that the person has to come back?
yes, yes, yeah.
So once they're on the list,
Yeah, we can, if we put somebody on a list and then didn't hear from them again and they moved away,
right?
they'd be on
Okay,
a list forever.
because it's not everybody has like an email or a regular accessible phone number.
So keep in mind, these are people without housing and they're moving,
Right.
right? So every 60 days, they have to come back, let us know they're still there. And with the ideas that we're talking about now, they can actually gain some priority by being reassessed, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so there's lots of
Moving
ideas
parts.
that are floating around right now, moving parts.
Because
That
I imagine somebody has to have basic things like an ID, which can be a challenge for some individuals to get.
um, uh, you know, I think it's not very hard for people to get on um, on a by name list. I don't want to really have a
Oversimplify it,
conversation.
yeah.
I don't want to have a conversation about criterias
Right.
and stuff at this point. But suffice to say, anybody that's on the streets in Yakima right now should be seeing Yakima Neighborhood Health if they're adults. They should be seeing Rod's House if they're a youth. If they're in the lower valley, they should be seeing YNSH or Yakima Neighborhood Health also has facilities in the lower valley as well.
So the individual should be going to these places, or
Yes, these are the access points for the by name.
Okay.
list. So think of the homeless population being in two primary categories right now. They're either in a shelter where they're being cared for, or they're out on the street.
Right.
Right. So if we look at those two realities, um, all being filtered by that number on the by name list, vulnerability prioritization, right? So there's the cutoff. Everybody that's below the cutoff needs to be in a diversion thought process. Like, where can they go for help? Where can they go for services? So all of the providers in town are still available for all of those folks. So UGM, Camp Hope, wonderful programs, right? So an individual has just maybe punched the director over at, say, Camp Hope, for example.
Okay.
So that guy can't come back, at least for some time period, right?
Right.
So what are that guy's options? Well, that guy has just reduced his options.
Right.
He hasn't eliminated them, but he's reduced his possibilities, right? So can he go to UGM? Yeah. So he goes to UGM. He's probably okay at UGM until he decides to hit that director.
So there is a level of self accountability that's definitely required.
I mean, absolutely. The shelters are very well equipped with people that are experienced.
Right.
These aren't people that have MSWs. They're not.
What's an MSW?
Master level social worker. I mean, they're not. They're not clinical people. They're people that a lot of them have had lived experience. That
Very practical. Walk the walk.
And they understand the people that they're serving. They care for them because they've been there. And those are the people that are magic. So the idea of congregant living is always in the tension of people having progress, right? It's an absolute need to have congregant living, but you also have to keep people that are in your facility safe. So you have to have the imposition of clean and sober. You can't let them take drugs right next to the guy that just got out of a 30-day program. It's not fair to do that, right? So,
Common sense.
so in the congregant living, clean and sober environment, all the people that don't want that are on the street, right? And so, if there were a solution that could individually house them temporarily in a shelter environment, that'd be a great thing. But that doesn't exist yet, right? So,
Seems like that will always be a tough uphill battle.
well, you can only imagine how expensive it would be to have a shelter with individual houses. There's been a couple
where
of
they can use,
agencies that have done some mixes of that,
right?
but the kind of thing we're talking about would be like the entire shelter would be individual
It would
housing.
have to be,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so that's
Costing a fortune.
yeah. And so when you have them in individual houses, then harm reduction makes great sense. Then you can meet them right where they're at, get them off the street.
Right.
It's funny, the things that the community could really be investing in is getting them off the street. Well, what does it take to get them off the street? Increasing housing inventory. They need the individual place, whether it's a shelter or permanent supportive housing. I will advocate for permanent supportive housing, though, because once the the lease is in their name, it's their home. There's no time frame they have to be out at. They don't have to do anything anybody else that rents a house or apartment
Right.
does.
They have to follow the same rules that the average person follows in the world.
Yeah, they have to still be part of a neighborhood, right? So
Right.
they're accountable to their neighborhood.
Right.
But there's a freedom associated with that kind of housing, and you can put your shoulders down and start getting real help. It still takes persistence from caseworkers to be able to get services to them, because sometimes you have to have a sales hat on to convince them how much benefit can come from having those services. Make them believe that they're important enough to have that care.
Right.
Right. It takes some sales.
Because you're dealing with years and years and years of who knows what they went through, and what kind of trauma was created that you're trying to. They've never known a safe place, come stay at my house. And that's where maybe somebody had been molested under the care of somebody else. So getting them to have that self-worth, I imagine is tough, but worth it in the end. Because when you've been doing this long enough to where you've probably seen some success stories where obviously not everybody makes it to the other side, but the ones that do are probably why you do what you do. You can't help everybody, but the few that do get helped make a difference.
So I think the organizations that are out there that have the best opportunity to do the greatest good are the organizations that don't privatize what they're doing, but network with other organizations.
Right.
When we work together, we're so much better together.
Community's method, man, goes a long way.
We can accomplish a whole lot more when we're working together. So coordinated entry, prioritization, vulnerability, all those things factor into that. Doing services together makes sense all day long. Even doing outreach together makes sense to me. So we've got some ways that we can grow. Networking is a great opportunity for Yakima.
There's lots of controversy when you're dealing with community in general. Narcan is one of them. We hear a lot about, pro Narcan, anti Narcan. Where do you fall on Narcan? Do you think Narcan vending machines should be out there, or do you think it's more presentable in the hands of a professional?
I like the idea of handing it out. I don't know that you have to be a high level professional. I don't think you have to be a medical provider. Putting that out on the street is a lifesaver. And the problem is bigger than us. The inconsistency from one pill to another pill, the potential danger is such a potential surprise impact that nobody can really keep themselves safe just because they think they're managing, how many they're taking or how much they're taking. So the idea of having Narcan instantly available is critical.
The argument is people are going to use Narcan to be able to take a higher dose, knowing that they can pump life back into them.
Or just the safety of having any dose at all. If they have it, they feel safer.
Right.
There's a valid tension in that. And if we could resolve one problem without having to go in the other, it would be great.
It'd be
but
great.
We can't get there from here.
Right.
So we have to be able to save lives.
Does somebody at some point have to carry their own weight? Or is free housing regardless of the progress that person makes? If I give them a house, at some point, do they have to get to a bridge where they're doing it on their own, they're maintaining a job, they're paying rent? Because, or else the flip side will say, we're gonna have a bunch of people taking free houses up that other people are working. I can see both sides.
I want to be really careful that I'm going to push some buttons here. And I understand that going into it. But I don't think we're anywhere near equipped to decide human potential on the onset. That's a ridiculous notion. Some people have the bandwidth to recover and heal and be restored, and some people don't. The trauma some people have experienced is so complex. Triggers can happen when you least expect them. It's not something that it's your responsibility to fix. That's an unfair expectation, right? So neurodivergence in any kind of form, any context at all, should never be judged on the onset. It should just never be, right? So the hope would be that we can lead people to get help, to get off the street. To just expect them to decide that that's a possibility is incredibly naive.
Right. I agree. And I think that's the things. I think both sides, right and left, try to make it so black and white from both perspectives, and it's just not this is not a black and white conversation. This is commingled with every color under the rainbow entering into this, and there's no one fix for everything.
Can I suggest the real bigger problem is, let's ask the question this way: why should your problem be my problem? Right? You're homeless. You've got this situation. You may get help and may not. Why do I care? Why does that become my problem? And I guess that's the biggest question that challenges all of us in the truest context, because it's so much easier to have apathy. It's so much easier to not care. It costs you less. It will give you more time to do fun things. It will give you a lot better quality of life if you can just get away without caring, right? But what I got back to originally is love and sacrifice are inseparable. You can't have one legitimately without the other, right?
If you want to help people, you got to be willing to have them in your neighborhood.
If you want to love so God only gave us two things to do. He couldn't have made it more simple, right? He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second thing he gave us to do was love your neighbor as yourself. A lot of the difficulty that a lot of us struggle with is we don't love ourselves very much. So loving our neighbor is a non-issue. But if you really want to love yourself and be able to have respect for yourself, because you are who you should be, right? Then you're equipped to love your neighbor, and that will matter to you. And that's when apathy becomes empathy and community solutions are real.
Well, there you guys have it. Thank you so much, Dave Hanson from SOC, Sunrise Outreach Center of Yakima. Something you want to leave people with also, anything that we didn't mention that you might want to bring up, maybe some programs or things you have going on right now, but more importantly, if If somebody's going through a severe time, how should they reach out to you? And if somebody wants to get involved, whether it be through labor's hours of coming to your facility and helping out or monetary donations, how can people reach out to you guys?
So the Yakima Vineyard Church is at 221 East Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, right across the street from the city building and county buildings. Um, and we're open from 9 o'clock in the morning till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Monday through Friday. If you need help, you can come there anytime and we'll help you or direct you to a place where you can get the help. If you're somebody that is experiencing homelessness and you're an adult and you're in the city of Yakima, I would go to Yakima Neighborhood Health and get on their by name list. Let them help you with directing for services. If there isn't housing immediately available to you, there's a solid argument for being in a shelter because having stability is what enables successful services. Without that, trying to live on the street, services are next to impossible. Um, so um, those are the best options. If you're in a youth situation, Rod's House is a great resource. Again, if you're in the Lower Valley, YNSH or Yakima Neighborhood Health are great resources. If you're somebody here in town or even countywide that's struggling with domestic violence, YWCA is the place to go.
How can people donate to your cause, to what you guys are doing specifically? Because it seems like you guys are very engaged, especially feeding these individuals. So I think people should show support if they can.
And honestly, the need is really great for funding support. So if you go to our webpage, socyakima.com, there's a donate now mechanism there that makes that really simple. And if you hate electronics, you can always just mail it to Sunrise Outreach.
Come drop off a brown paper bag.
Yeah, at 221 East Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, Yakima, Washington, 98901.